She looked at him the way you look at something that's wandered into the wrong room. Not unkindly, not exactly, but with the brisk assessor's efficiency of a woman who has been given authority over a space and intends to use it. She smiled at her desk. Tanner Wick was standing at the entrance to the Meridian Club's private gallery in downtown Calgary, holding a cup of Tim Hortons in one hand and his 9-year-old daughter's wrist loosely in the other, and Claudine Marsden had already made her decision about him before he'd opened his mouth. What none of them knew, not Tanner, not Claudine, not the journalist, standing 20 feet away with his phone, was that the next 45 minutes would be watched by 37 million people before the week was out, and that nothing in that gallery would ever look quite the same afterward. But before any of that, there was just a man in a canvas shop jacket and a woman with a clipboard, and the 4 seconds it's between them that changed everything. Before we go further, if you're new here, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Every week we bring you stories that remind you what people are actually made of when it counts. Drop a comment when you've finished this one and let us know where you're watching from. We love hearing how far these stories travel. Now, let's go back to Calgary. The Valerian series launch was the kind of event that didn't need to announce itself. There were no banners outside the Meridian Club, no sandwich boards on the sidewalk, no line of people waiting in the November cold. The invitations had gone out 8 weeks earlier on heavy cardstock, by courier, to a list of precisely 63 names. If you knew what the Valerian was, you already understood. If you had to ask, you hadn't been invited. The vehicle itself, the Valerian GT9, limited to 12 units in Canada, represented 7 years of development by the European parent company and used a torque distribution system that had quietly become the most talked about drivetrain technology in the industry over the past decade. Smooth over ice, precise on mountain switchbacks. Engineers at competing firms had been trying to reverse engineer the approach for years with limited success, because the foundational patent sat with a single individual who had filed it 11 years ago when he was still a lead engineer at a firm in Lethbridge and had no idea it was worth anything yet. That individual was Tanner Wick. He was 42 years old, though he looked close to it in the particular honest way of a man who has done physical work for a long time and doesn't think much about how he appears. He was broad across the shoulders and had the hands of someone who actually uses them. Engine grease had a way of settling into the knuckle lines that no amount of scrubbing fully erased. He drove a 2009 Ford pickup with 340,000 kilometers on it, which still ran perfectly because he maintained it himself. He'd been wearing the same canvas work jacket for 6 years, dark brown, oil stain on the left sleeve from a brake job the previous spring that he'd never quite gotten out. Walking beside him, holding 2 of his fingers in a way that meant she wasn't actually worried about getting lost, but simply preferred the contact, was his daughter Rue. Rue Wick was 9 years old and had her late mother's eyes and her father's habit of looking at mechanical things longer than most people thought necessary. She carried a small spiral notebook in the front pocket of her vest. Not a diary, an engineering notebook, the same kind Tanner used, because she had insisted on having one and had been using it since she was 7 to document observations about things she found interesting. At the moment, the things she found most interesting were internal combustion engines, bird migration patterns, and whether the new Valerian really did use a magnetic differential, or whether that was, as she put it, just marketing talk. She had read the brochure 3 times on the drive from Pincher Creek. They'd left at 4 in the morning. Tanner had moved back to Pincher Creek 4 years ago, after Elaine died. He hadn't planned to. He'd planned to keep working, keep the apartment in Lethbridge, keep the routines that structured the days, and kept him from thinking too clearly about the space where she used to be. But Rue was 5, and 5-year-olds need more than routine, and Tanner's parents were in Pincher Creek, and his father had a garage that was slowly becoming too much to manage alone. So he'd taken the job he'd never imagined wanting. He rebuilt engines. He did brake lines and oil changes, and the kind of patient diagnostic work that required more thinking than people assumed. He liked it. It turned out he had always liked it. He'd just spent 15 years working on it in a more expensive building with better lighting. The licensing deal that had brought him to Calgary that evening had been in negotiation for 9 months. Valerian's parent company wanted to extend his patent license by 10 years, a number that Priya Mahan, his former colleague who now handled his business interests, had described in her characteristically understated way as significant. The event tonight was both a launch and a celebration of that extension. Tanner's name was on the official program as keynote patent holder and special guest. There was going to be a brief ceremony. Priya had told him to be there at 7. He arrived at 6:58, Tim Hortons in hand, Rue at his side. Claudine Marsden was standing inside the entrance with a tablet, and the composed posture of someone who had spent the day managing 17 small disasters and was prepared for several more. She was 36, sharp-featured, and had worked her way from her father's dealership group into the VP role at Valerian Motors Canada through a combination of genuine competence and a very specific kind of drive that doesn't leave much room for pausing before acting. She was good at her job. She moved fast, processed quickly, kept events running on time. She looked at Tanner. She looked at the Tim Hortons cup, the canvas jacket, the spiral notebook sticking out of Rue's vest pocket. She looked at the truck he'd parked at the far end of the lot rather than at the front because it seemed presumptuous to park it closer, though that thought had occurred only to him. And something closed in her expression. Quietly, the way a door closes when someone thinks no one is watching. "Good evening," she said. "Are you with the catering service? Delivery entrance is on the side. Around?" "I'm a guest," Tanner said. He said it evenly, without irritation, though the sentence felt strange in his mouth the way it always did when he had to say it in places like this. Claudine looked at her tablet. Her finger moved along the list. "Name?" "Wick. Tanner Wick." A pause. "I don't see." "I'm listed as patent holder, special guest." He didn't elaborate beyond that. She looked at the tablet again, then at him, then at the tablet once more, with the expression of someone who has found the name but is uncertain how to reconcile it with the person standing in front of them. "There may be some confusion about credentials tonight," she said carefully. "We've had a few walk-in attempts. I'll need to verify before I can allow access." Tanner set his coffee on the ledge of the reception desk and took the invitation card from his jacket pocket. It was the original courier-delivered card, which Rue had been using as a bookmark in the brochure. It had his name on it, and the event details and a small foil seal in the corner. Claudine held it for longer than necessary. Rue was watching her with the focused, data-gathering look she used when she was trying to understand something. "Is there a problem?" Tanner asked, still even, still mild. "I just want to make sure everything is in order," Claudine said. And she said it pleasantly, the way you say something pleasant when what you actually mean is something else entirely. "If you'd like to wait just outside while I contact our event coordinator." "The event starts in 2 minutes," Tanner said. "It'll only take a moment." Rue looked up at her father. He looked down at her. Something passed between them that didn't need words. "All right," he said. "Call whoever you need to call." What happened next was that Claudine's event coordinator, a man named Harris Lund, who would later become significant for reasons no one in that gallery yet knew, answered her call and told her, in a slightly strained voice, that he was dealing with an issue on the other side of the room and that she should consult the printed program. She asked him specifically about a Tanner Wick. He said yes, right. He was on the list. She asked in what capacity. Harris paused and said, "Special guest, patent holder," something like that, and his voice had the quality of someone who knows more than they're letting on, and has decided this is not the moment to let it on. She hung up and looked at Tanner. "You're on the list," she said. "Yes," he said. "I'll need to see photo ID to complete the check-in." He handed her his driver's license without any particular expression. She studied it, handed it back, and then instead of stepping aside, she looked at Rue. "There's a family lounge adjacent to the main hall," she said. "Children aren't generally part of the event program. It might be more comfortable for her to." "She's on the guest list," Tanner said. His voice had changed. Not in volume, not in temperature, but something in it had shifted, the way a dial shifts when someone adjusts a setting from one position to another. Check under our wick. Claudine checked. There it was. She said nothing for a moment. "Rue is 9, Tanner said. She read the technical brochure for this vehicle 3 times, and can explain the torque distribution system better than most of the engineers I know. She was specifically invited. She is going to go inside with me. And if there is a genuine reason she cannot, I'd like you to explain it clearly so I can understand it." Claudine opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. There was no genuine reason. They both knew it. Rue looked up at Claudine with her notebook clutched in both hands. "Are we going in?" she asked. Not accusatory, just asking. Before Claudine could answer, the side door opened and Priya Mahan walked in from the coat check, still buttoning her blazer, a leather portfolio tucked under one arm. She was 51 years old and had spent 25 years in automotive patent law, and she moved through a room the way a ship moves through water, with complete indifference to whatever was in the way. She looked at Tanner. "There you are. Martin's been asking about you." She looked at Claudine. She looked at the clipboard. She looked back at Claudine with an expression that communicated quite efficiently that she had sized up the situation and was prepared to resolve it in whatever direction was necessary. "Is there an issue?" she asked. Claudine said, "I was just completing verification of." "He's the guest of honor," Priya said, not unkindly. "Just as a statement of fact, the way you say that the sky is a particular color." She opened the portfolio and withdrew a single sheet, the event program, printed on the same cardstock as the invitations. She set it on the counter and tapped the top of the page. Under Featured Guest of the Evening, in the same typeface as the rest of the document, Tanner Wick, Lead Patent Engineer, Valerian Torque Distribution System. And below that, in a line that Claudine read once and then read again, Holder of the Foundational Intellectual Property Licensing Agreement that enables global Valerian production. Extended tonight for a term of 10 years. The gallery was not quiet. There was music, conversation, the sound of people circulating with glasses of wine 30 feet away. But in the small radius of the entrance, it felt very quiet indeed. Claudine looked at Tanner. He was standing in his shop jacket, his Tim Hortons sitting on the ledge where he'd left it, his daughter's notebook in her hand. He was looking at her with the calm of someone who had been certain of who he was from the beginning, and had simply been waiting for the rest of the room to catch up. Her face did something complicated. "I owe you an apology," she said, and then she stopped, because the sentence had come out more automatic than genuine, and she could hear that herself. "Not to me," Tanner said quietly. He looked at Rue, to her. She asked to come tonight because she wanted to see this car. She read everything she could find about it, and the first thing she got when she walked in the door was someone telling her there was a children's waiting room. Claudine turned to Rue, and whatever she'd prepared herself to say seemed to dissolve when she actually looked at the child. This small, precise, serious person with her spiral notebook and her father's eyes, who was watching the whole exchange with the expression of someone collecting data on a phenomenon she hadn't yet classified. "I'm sorry," Claudine said. Her voice was not steady. "I made assumptions about who you were before I let either of you show me. That wasn't fair to you or your dad." Rue considered this with visible seriousness. Then, "Okay," she said. "Can we go see the car now?" Something shifted in Claudine's face. It was not a smile, not quite, but it was the beginning of one. "Yes," she said. "Please." A man named Derek Tam, a journalist who had been covering the Valerian launch for a trade publication, had been standing near the coat check since 6:49 and had been filming since 6:57, when something in the scene at the entrance had struck him as unusual. He had not set out to film anything newsworthy. He had been texting his editor and happened to glance up at the wrong moment, and something in the posture of the man in the shop jacket, the stillness of him, the absence of any defensive body language, despite everything, had made Derek lower his phone and start paying attention. He uploaded the video at 11:15 that night. The caption was 14 words. By 2 in the morning, it had been shared 40,000 times. By the time Tanner woke up the following day at 5:30 to open the garage, it had 4 million views, and his phone had notifications he was not equipped to process. He read the first 3 comments, put the phone face down on the workbench, and went to work on a 2007 Honda Civic with a clutch that needed replacing. Priya called him at 9. "You need to see this," she said. "I've seen some of it. The full picture, I mean." A pause. Harris Lund didn't put Rue on the guest list with no title because of an oversight. He did it deliberately. Someone told him to. Tanner set down his wrench. Who? That's what I'm working on. But there's a name that keeps coming up. The name was Sterling Quaid. Quaid was a patent attorney based in Toronto who had spent the past 2 years mounting a challenge to the foundational patent Tanner held on the torque distribution system. The challenge was procedural, claiming that the original filing had relied on prior art from a third-party research paper that had never been properly credited. It was the kind of argument that sounded technical enough to be confusing and expensive enough to be threatening, even if you were confident it would eventually fail. Quaid had a client. The client stood to benefit considerably if the license extension was delayed or invalidated. The Valerian event, Priya had come to understand through a contact at the venue's management company, had been flagged to Quaid's office 6 weeks before the launch. Harris Lund, who had worked at the Meridian Club for 3 years and who had a freelance consulting arrangement that nobody at the venue had known about, had been paid to make a small, specific adjustment. Format Tanner's invitation without his title. Just the name. Tanner Wick, nothing else. The intent was not for a confrontation, exactly, not visibly. The intent was for Tanner to arrive looking like himself, a man from a small town in his work clothes, and to be filtered, delayed, possibly turned away, and for that process to be observed and potentially recorded. For the story to become, man claiming to hold a major automotive patent shows up to exclusive event and is asked to leave. A question mark over his credibility, his claims, his right to the room, right before the extension was signed. What Quaid had not accounted for was Claudine Marsden doing what she did in front of a journalist, and he had not accounted for Tanner Wick standing in that entrance with the absolute stillness of a man who has nothing to prove and has known it from the beginning. Claudine found out about Quaid and Harris Lund on a Thursday 48 hours after the video had passed 25 million views. She found out because she went looking. Because something in the entrance on Wednesday night had nagged at her long enough that she'd gone back through the event correspondence that morning and asked her coordinator questions she should have asked before the event. Harris resigned before she could ask him. She called Martin Chow, her director, at 9 in the morning. She told him everything. He listened without interrupting, which was not unusual for Martin, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You were set up," he said. "Yes," she said, "and I walked right into it. Because of the jacket." A pause, because of the jacket. There was a silence on the line that was not uncomfortable, more like the silence of someone who is choosing what to say next rather than not knowing what to say. "You should talk to him," Martin said. "I know." Her public statement went out on Saturday morning. 11 paragraphs. Her name, not the company name. She had written it herself over 2 evenings and rewritten the third paragraph 4 times until it said what she actually meant rather than what she wanted to be seen meaning. The line that got shared the most was the one near the end. "I looked at a man and decided in under 5 seconds who he was and what he deserved. I was wrong about both. I am not interested in calling that a mistake, because a mistake implies an accident, and this was a reflex, one I have been carrying without examining it, and one I intend to examine now." Tanner read the statement in the garage, sitting on a turned-over bucket with his thermos in his hand. He read it once, then went back to the third paragraph and read it again. Then he called Priya. "She knows," he said. "The whole thing, or about herself," he said. "That's the harder part to know." Priya was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to do?" "Give Quaid's challenge time to collapse on its own," he said. "It will. The prior art argument doesn't hold, never held. Without the Lund arrangement, there was nothing behind it but paperwork, and I want to let her statement stand without me adding to it. She said what needed to be said. The press is going to want a response from you. They can want." Martin Chow called Tanner directly on Sunday morning. He was 60 years old and had been in the automotive industry since before Tanner was born, and he had the voice of someone who had seen most things and reserved judgment on all of them until he had what he needed. "I want to apologize on behalf of the company," he said. "I appreciate that," Tanner said. "Claudine is a good executive," Martin said. "She moves fast. Fast is sometimes exactly what's needed, and sometimes it's the thing that gets you. A pause. I think she knows which one this was. I think she does too, Tanner said. The extension was signed in a short ceremony 10 days later. 7 people in a conference room in Calgary. No catering. Priya and 2 lawyers on Tanner's side. Martin and 2 lawyers from Valerian. Rue was there because Tanner had brought her and because she had been there for the beginning of it, and he thought it was right that she see how it ended. She sat beside him with her engineering notebook open on the table and drew a detailed cross-section of the Valerian's drivetrain from memory while the lawyers did their work. Sterling Quade's patent challenge was formally withdrawn 6 weeks later. The procedural corruption in the filing had been documented thoroughly enough that continuing it would have caused more damage to Quade's practice than abandoning it. The client he'd been representing quietly withdrew. Harris Lund did not work in venue management again. The sequence of events did not receive as much public attention as the video had. These things rarely do, but it was complete, and it was documented, and it was permanent. Claudine Marsden called Tanner once, about 3 weeks after the extension signing. She said she wanted to say something to him directly that a press statement couldn't hold. I want you to know I went back through everything, she said. The Harris arrangement, the invitation formatting. I understand now that I was positioned. But I've spent a lot of time making sure I'm honest with myself about what that means, because being positioned only worked because of something I already had. Tanner said, I know. I'm not asking for anything, she said. I just wanted you to hear that I'm not done looking at it. He thought about that for a moment. That's the right approach, he said. It's also the slower one. I've been figuring that out, she said. They stayed on the phone for another few minutes. The conversation moved into practical things. She'd heard through the industry about the foundation he was planning, and she had questions. He answered them honestly. When he hung up, he stood in the garage for a moment, listening to the November wind off the foothills coming through the gap under the bay door. He thought about Elaine. She would have found the whole thing infuriating, which was how she found most injustices. She would have been loud about it, in the way she was loud about things that mattered, and then she would have found something useful to do with the anger. She was better at that than he was. She had always been better at converting fury into action. He was more of a waiter. He waited for the right moment, and then he moved. Different methods, same result, usually. He had been planning the foundation for 2 years, the Wick Trades Foundation, for young people from small towns who wanted to go into engineering and automotive work, but didn't have the connections or the credentials that the industry assumed you needed. He'd been waiting for the license extension to clear before making it real. He'd told himself it was about financial certainty. If he was being honest, it was also about something harder to name, a reluctance to announce something he cared about before he knew the ground under it was solid. The ground was solid now. The launch was in March, in the community hall in Pincher Creek, not Calgary, not a hotel ballroom or a rented gallery with catering. The same hall where Elaine had organized a fundraiser 7 years ago for a kid from town who needed surgery they couldn't afford. The same room. It felt right. 45 people came. Most of them had driven from small towns within 2 hours. The scholarship recipients were 11 young people, 8 of them from rural Alberta and Saskatchewan, 3 from small communities in northern Ontario, who wanted to work in automotive engineering or skilled trades, and who had never had a door open for them that felt like it was meant for them. Tanner's remarks were 10 minutes. He had written them over 6 evenings, and kept cutting the parts that sounded like a speech. What remained was just what had happened and what he thought it meant. He talked about what it felt like to be looked at and already be categorized before you'd said your name. He talked about how often that happened, not in event galleries with polished floors, but everywhere, in job interviews, at banks, in the kinds of rooms where a decision is being made about your future, and someone in that room has already made a quieter decision about who they think you are. He talked about Elaine briefly. He kept it short because that part was private, in a way he still protected. He just said that she had worked the early shift at a diner in Lethbridge for 3 years while completing her engineering certificate, and that she had told him once, after a long day, that the hardest part wasn't the hours. The hardest part was convincing herself she was allowed to finish something that nobody around her had told her she was allowed to want. He paused there. This foundation is for her too, he said. Rue was sitting in the front row. She had her notebook open. She had been documenting the evening the way she documented things. Not writing every word, just noting what seemed important. Later, Tanner would read her notes and find, in her precise small handwriting, Dad said Mom was allowed to want things. That was the part that mattered. After the remarks, the 11 recipients stood up one by one and said their names and where they were from. A girl from a reserve in northern Saskatchewan. A boy from a farming community outside Moose Jaw who had been rebuilding engines since he was 12 and had never met a single engineer who came from where he came from. A woman from Pincher Creek itself, 24 years old, had worked at the gas station for 4 years, wanted to design hybrid systems, and had been told more than once, kindly but firmly, that she should be realistic about her options. She shook Tanner's hand at the end of the evening and didn't say anything for a moment. Then, I didn't know you could come from here and do that. You can, he said. That was all. She nodded once and went to find her family. Claudine was there. She hadn't announced herself. She had called Priya 2 weeks before the event and asked, without framing it as anything other than what it was, whether she would be welcome. Priya had checked and called back within the hour. She sat in the 5th row and was wearing dark gray and had her hair down and was not easily recognizable as the polished VP from the gallery in Calgary, which was, she thought, perhaps fitting. She watched Tanner speak. She watched Rue in the front row with her notebook. When Tanner said this foundation is for her too and paused, Claudine looked at the floor for a moment because it felt private. At the end of the evening, she stayed. Tanner found her near the side door, talking to the woman from Pincher Creek about automotive certification programs. He waited until the conversation ended and then walked over. You came, he said. I did. She looked at him. Thank you for letting me. He nodded. They were quiet for a moment in the way of two people who have been through something significant and don't need to perform any particular feeling about it. The 11 this year, she said. Are you planning to scale that? 20 next year, he said. If the funding holds. Martin's company made a contribution. I know, she said. I suggested it. He looked at her. Something recalibrated in his expression, the way something recalibrates when you receive information that adjusts what you thought you already knew. Thank you, he said. It was the right place for it, she said simply. Rue appeared at Tanner's elbow with the thoroughness of a child who has completed all the tasks she set for herself and is ready for the next phase of the evening. She looked at Claudine with the frank, direct assessment of someone who keeps good records. You're the lady from the event, Rue said. Yes, Claudine said. You apologized. Rue appeared to be cross-referencing this with the notes she'd made at the time. That was 4 months ago. It was. Are you better now at not doing that? Claudine held the question for a moment. It was, she thought, possibly the most precise question anyone had asked her since October. Not, have you suffered enough? Not, do you understand what you did? Just, are you better now? I'm working on it, Claudine said. I think so, but I won't know for certain for a while yet. Rue appeared to find this acceptable. She looked at her father. Can we go to Tim Hortons before we drive home? We're 2 hours from home, he said. I know, she said. I want a hot chocolate, and maybe a Timbit. A pause. Okay, 12 Timbits. He looked at Claudine. Something passed across his face that was not quite a smile, and not quite something more than that. It was good to see you, he said. You too, she said, and meant it. They shook hands. Claudine watched him take Rue's hand and walk toward the door, Rue already telling him something with great authority about the specifications she'd heard mentioned during the remarks from one of the scholarship recipients, her voice carrying back through the hall with the bright certainty of a child who has found an environment where her questions are worth asking. Claudine stood in the community hall in Pincher Creek, listening to the room settle around her. The scholarship recipients were still talking in clusters near the back. The woman from town was laughing at something Priya had said. Outside, through the door Tanner and Rue had just gone through. The Alberta March night was cold and clear. She put on her coat. She had a 3-hour drive back to Calgary. In her bag was a copy of the Foundation's selection criteria that she'd picked up from the table near the entrance. She intended to read it carefully, not as a donor reviewing what her money was doing, but as someone who had spent 4 months thinking about what it meant to look at a person and decide in 5 seconds who they were, and who was still slowly learning to catch the reflex before it moved. She walked to the door and stepped out into the dark. Tanner's truck was still in the lot. She could see the silhouette of Rue in the passenger seat, already working on something in her notebook by the light of the window. Tanner was standing at the driver's side, looking up at the sky. Alberta sky, no clouds, nothing between the ground and the stars but cold, clean distance. She got in her car and started the drive home. The highway was empty, and the night was brilliant overhead and somewhere behind her in a small parking lot, in a small town. A man who had built something careful and lasting was standing under the same sky, his daughter waiting for him, the hot chocolate still 20 minutes down the road. He looked up for another moment. Then he got in the truck, and the engine turned over on the first try, the way it always did, because he had built that too.